Hey everyone, and welcome to Curiosity First. Today we have a very special episode with many people. We'll be discussing a range of topics from um, polymathic studies to community building to building trans ideological fellowships and so much more. Um, we're gonna be breaking it down from the perspective of stages of literacy, as Robert brought into the show as a possibility. He's gonna break that down, but before we do that, I want to go around and get a little background from everybody, the biography and the intellectual interests. Sorry if I seem a bit off today. It's because I have a post-viral kind of cough, and I'm trying not to cough and concentrate on what I'm saying. So if I'm a bit off, that's why. But and if I disappear off camera for any seconds, start coughing, just keep talking as if it's not happening. Anyway, we'll start with Angela and give us a bit of your background and what you're all about, and then we'll move around.
Yeah, hey everyone. My name is Angela Cautalessa Myers. I was born in Berkeley, California, and grew up in the East Bay near San Francisco. I was raised in Christian schools, and so I was completely indoctrinated, from preschool through 12th grade, and definitely like identified as Christian growing up. And then once I got out of that, I kind of had this reflection on like how many Christians weren't Christ-like. And I really love Jesus. I've always agreed with the golden rule and Christ's philosophy, but I just didn't like how Christians behave. So I've mostly been on kind of a solo spiritual journey. I kind of dabble with Buddhism and New Age philosophy, having come from Berkeley. But mostly I'm just spiritual without being religious, but definitely like Jesus. And so I was taught to live a life of service. And to me, in my very naive Christian school, like teen years, I thought, well, if I want to make the world a better place, then I should work for government. And I was really naive, but yeah, I was very like an overachiever and government oriented. So like I interned for the governor of California between high school and college. And then while I was getting a master's degree, I interned at the White House. And then that led to getting hired there. So I was a non-political civil servant at the executive office of the president for about 6 years under the last Bush's last term, and also for all of Obama's first term and part of his second. But my real passion was learning. And so I really wanted to work in adult education. And turns out there used to be, now it's all closed down, but there used to be a part of government called the Center for Leadership Development. And I spent about 9 years there managing training and leadership development programs for leaders from across the federal government. While I was doing that, I decided to get my doctoral degree from George Washington University. So I've got a doctorate in education. The exact degree title is Human and Organizational Learning. And I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation on modern day polymaths. And it was pretty shocking back in 2015 when I started researching polymaths. I couldn't find much in the academic literature. There was Robert Root Bernstein's work. He was really the main thinker looking at polymaths from history. But I couldn't find people doing real research on modern polymath people. It was almost as if the assumption was you had to be dead and it was accessible. Like you had to be a creative genius to be tied to the word in any way. So my goal was really to kind of modernize it and to democratize it. Like why? And granted, there is a difference between being a creative, eminent polymath genius and being polymathic. Like obviously it comes on a spectrum, but I always felt like I was this hodgepodge of things that didn't go together, liberal Berkeley and conservative Christian schools. My mother was a Cuban immigrant. My dad was like this truck driving, beer drinking white dude, American. I was raised in a multi-generational household. And there were, I came from uneducated people and I became a doctor. And there were just all these parts of my identity that made me feel like I don't fit into boxes. And polymath was kind of the closest thing I could get to a label that sort of summarized my multifaceted identity. So I wrote the dissertation on polymathy. I'm actually quite passionate about it. I founded Polymath's Place LLC. It's also a social media brand. I've got a Facebook community. And so at this point, I no longer work in government. I offer organizational consulting services to organizations to help them in this shift to where really the most employable humans now are polymathic generalists working with an AI stack. The age of specialization is mostly dead now. Right. And I've also been a reformer, a social reformer. I spent a lot of years as a criminal justice reform advocate because the criminal justice system in America is a humanitarian crisis. Like a lot of people don't realize, but we have 1/4 of planet Earth's prisoners here in one country, and we're less than 5% of the global population. So I founded and created the Prison Transparency Project. That's available at prisontransparency.com. Now I'm also an education reform advocate. I'm involved with the human intelligence movement. We're doing research and publishing papers. So that's another cool thing I've been involved with. But mostly about me, like I'm interested in lots of things. I'm interested in how people can become their best, fullest selves, their most authentic selves. I understand that through the lens of polymathy and also government accountability. Having come from a Cuban mother, my family was from Spain, and the Civil War led my family to Cuba, and then communists made Cuba crazy. And so I just have like in my blood a real awareness for how dysfunctional governments impact real human lives. And I've worked inside the belly of the beast myself for 15 years. And then I became a truth teller for what I learned about its dysfunction. So I create content on social media and write books, and you can learn more about me at Dr. Angela Meyers, MEYERS.com.
All right.
All right. Benjamin, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Thanks so much for sharing all that. It's really fascinating. I'm really glad to hear and understand more about your background. And I definitely identify as a polymath myself, for sure. I have a wide range of interests. I would say the main primary driver behind what really fuels my interest is trying to help humanity solve its greatest problems. And so I pay a lot of attention to the many problems. I'm super well versed in the meta crisis theory. I've watched probably 30 or 40 hours worth of Daniel Schmachtenberger's work, and I spend a lot of time trying to understand the problems so that I can do my best to try to help come up with solutions. And so I'm passionate about permaculture design and eco-village development. I studied that with Stephen Brooks, with Ecoversity, who has founded a number of successful eco-villages down in Costa Rica. So I'm passionate about that, as well as alternative economic systems that can be net positive and regenerative. I don't have like a degree in economics, but I've studied, probably hundreds of hours at this point studying capitalism, socialism, communism, and things like Nordic capitalism and social democracy, and also Prout economic theory. Just trying to understand how we can create some sort of hybridized version of all of these that's better than, the different systems we have currently that humanity has experimented with. Which brings me to a lot of experience in the game B space, which, the online game B space really spends a lot of time trying to figure out how to shift from game A, which is, late stage capitalism, zero sum games, towards game B, which would be considered more omni-win, net positive, regenerative. And so those are some of the core principles that I really resonate with. And then I've spent a lot of time in like the meta-modern community, which is just trying to understand the both and synthesis between modernism and postmodernism. And again, there's a lot of debate there, but it's fun to just be a part of the conversation. I grew up in Newport, Rhode Island. I am a business owner and I work remotely. I'm currently nomadic. I own a place outside of Asheville, North Carolina. I lived in Austin, Texas for a decade. I've lived in Boulder, Colorado, and have kind of just hopped around a lot of these like vortexes with conscious community with a lot of people that are really passionate about this kind of stuff. And I'm big into spirituality, meditation, nonviolent communication, conscious communication, all of that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Sounds great.
Inquisitor Black. You want to go by Black, right?
Yes, thank you, Thomas. I feel like I'm a bit of an outlier here, but then again, all the people that I talk to, different spaces and different backgrounds and different approaches, maybe I'm not really such an outlier. But so first, I do like to think of myself as an artist now. Me and Robert were talking a little bit about this, about how it's kind of like when Prince started to say he was just a symbol, and everybody took it as a sort of joke, and it's like an ironic thing. I think metamodern irony plays a lot into this. I've had a project called Telecatron for almost 2 decades that started out as a sort of punk rock band, a sort of spiritual punk rock band. It was trying to merge ideas from like Ray Kurzweil about the singularity to spiritual ideas of like a spiritual singularity. So this is, like I said, almost 2 decades ago, and then it became very kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where it started to kind of poetically, teleologically come to fruition or shape itself in ways that even I didn't expect it. So again, there's a bit of irony there, but this is where I became oriented around things like game being the liminal web. And the strange thing was I've been trying to think of when exactly, because people can say, oh, I saw this video or that video, and I can't seem to remember exactly how I got into it. It might have been Jordan Hall. I know in the early days he did a video on like collective consciousness. He talked about his daughter and her friends building things in Minecraft all together, like in real time, and him realizing that this is the nature that we're going to see in the future with VR and younger people, taking things like memes and data and keeping them all together, weaving them together for new meaning and new patterns and new images artistically and for education. He kind of got this felt sense. So I tend to resonate with people who do lean more into the spiritual side of things or the intuitive side. So for me, I don't really have any education at all. I failed 7th grade 3 times, and that kind of plays into the nature of some of my online persona and some of my political opinions. I'm kind of can be a bit edgy, contrarian, non-PC. I tend to push the integrity of people's questioning and their answers, just to play with it and to offer something new and interesting, especially in the art world, something edgy. But when Angela was talking about like the polymath thing, a lot of these terms I didn't really come across, or I come across them but didn't understand the academic actual meaning to them. So then, interestingly enough, through the liminal web and through people who are educated in academics, I started to realize, okay, a lot of these terms get thrown around, but they do mean something. They do have, specific origins, and it matters how you use it. Recently, I've been getting a lot into Dave Snowden. I really love his work. I think he's got, some of the most interesting perspectives out there. And he's kind of an old fuddy-duddy, and he jokes about it, but he talks about, the importance of the origins of language and how we use it. So for me, artistically, that's important. And I also, I oriented a lot around Jamie Wheel and flow states because of my improvisation in music and stuff. So Jamie Wheel also kind of weaves in and out of the game B and the metamodern spaces too. Mm-hmm. And so for me, when Angela was talking about this nature of consciousness or even homeostasis through the polymath, for me, I think about that which is polyrhythmatic in dancing or improv and how much that can be therapeutic. And if I had to kind of say my position or whatever, however it is that I weave it in, I would definitely say that that's a huge part of it. However, like I said, however that shows up for you. But it's great to be here. I appreciate everyone being here.
So Robert, do you want to? Well, you can give a bit of your background, but then after you do that, get into your model, or not your model, but the model you'd like to talk about the 5 stages of literacy. Yeah.
All right, for those who still don't know me, Dr. Robert Conan Ryan. I have a lot of nicknames floating around, and sort of my ironic nickname is Double R. I got that because the real. Do you know who the real Double R is? Anybody? You know who that is? Rick Rubin, the producer.
The music guy.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Oh
yeah.
yeah,
From
yeah.
founder of Def Jam Records and then American and then basically he's worked with so many high profile hip hop but also cross spectrum artists. Like he's up there with like Pharrell Williams as one of the most successful producers, and he's got a unique style. He's sort of like a Zen minimalist, so some producers really like to put their stamp on every project. They'll work the boards, they'll help you write material. They really become a co-author with you. Whereas his is entirely about sort of like being a guided guru, meditative guru, and he never touches the boards, not once, like on his projects. So he's a minimalist producer who really focuses around helping the artists find themselves in each song and each track. And so he has a unique sort of like conversational style with people. So when I was in the music industry, so that's one of the things I did as part of my polymathic experience is when I was young, I started off playing piano really young at like age 4, 5, and like trying to write my own songs, and wanted to grow up and be a composer. When I saw Mozart, Amadeus, and all that sort of thing. And I was like, I was born in the wrong time because I wanted to be a composer. And then, I saw basically how sort of like fringe classical music had become by the current time. When I was by about age 8 or 9, I was like, that's not going to happen. So, but basically, I was always I was one of those permanent gifted kids. So like I was in Delaware growing up, and although born in South Carolina, I lived there till like age 8. So I learned to speak in the South. So it was really easy for a Southern accent to come out of me. But at age 9, I went up to Delaware, and I was in permanent gifted. And that meant I was one of only 6 kids in Northern Delaware that was like basically gifted was our homeroom. Where for most other kids, they had regular classes and they would go to gifted a couple days a week. So we had like a special teacher, and basically I got to do everything. It's a lot sort of like Daniel Schmalkenberger's story, where it was almost like being homeschooled. But I was homeschooled by the state, which is highly unusual. So when people want to get to understand me better, that's probably the best reveal of my background. Is that's what I had in common with Schmalkenberger, was having an unusual sort of like guided, sort of like do whatever you want education. And so, like 1st and 2nd grade, I was like studying ancient Egypt and the pyramids and trying to figure out how to decipher hieroglyphs and speak Egyptian. And, by like 3rd grade, I was doing algebra, and I won like there was like a stock market contest that I won for like elementary schools. Well, no, I got like 3rd out of like 250 teams or something like that in the stock market. So I was like, maybe I'll grow up and do business. But I had a lot of these different, polymathic experiences. I was a National Geography B. I was like a state finalist, and it was 4th through 8th grade, and I was the only 4th grader on stage, and it was all 7th and 8th graders in the final, and then me, And so that's why I'm a geography nerd. So I'm very big on me and Jim Rutt share that idea of we love maps, and we love being able to play games with maps and mapping territories and things. And so that's part of where I got that from. But basically, I was that kind of kid. I wrote like a major article in 6th grade about the Gulf War, and ended up getting reprinted in like a bunch of newspapers. It was like kid writes article about Gulf War, watching it on television. And so I had a whole series of these things. I was also an athlete. So I played a lot of sports. I played football. When I was younger, I played soccer. I was a skater. Although I was never that good, I really liked hanging out with the skaters more than actually and supporting them. But I was, okay at it. And so I have friends who are still professional skaters to this day. Bobby Azarian and I actually get along a lot on that point because he's big into skating culture. But so I was sort of like a kid who did a little bit of everything, had a rock band in high school, then worked in hip hop recording studios. I thought I was going to make it in the major label system. And just as I was getting recommended to move up the ladder is when the industry crashed. It was like the year of the industry crash was the year that my studio was trying to make me their liaison to Bad Boy Records. And basically we're trying to become one of the 4 remote Bad Boy Records studios. Now that was before I knew anything about what a horrible person Diddy was, but I've heard a lot of rumors very early on because of that relationship. So I was a talent scout and beat maker. I didn't rap. I can never do that. I don't have a natural talent for it. But I did a lot of talent scouting, and I did some beat making on people's records and things of that nature. Continued on in the music industry and did a bunch of stuff for a while, but it was all essentially kind of like behind the scenes. I was consulting for various acts, singer-songwriters especially, and then also sort of like that whole Eurofolk movement, the kind of music that, Alex Ebert, Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros were doing. I got into that genre and was I had the band I was working with there won the single day sales record of all time for CDs in Delaware in 2010, which was the last year anybody won any CD sales records. And they beat the Beatles anthology. And I designed the cover for the album, and the band broke up 6 months later. We played at New York Fashion Week. I got to meet Diplo before he was famous backstage at the Starlight Ballroom in New York City with management, MGMT. I actually, they were too high to talk, but they were like, but I got to party with management. So I got to do all that, but I also did a bunch of degrees. Okay, so I'll just do the shortest version of that because this is getting long. But basically, in my undergraduate, I started off in international relations and anthropology. I was like in the International Model United Nations Club, and I won a national gavel award. And they only give out like 8 of those, and there was like 6,000 contestants. And then one of the others was the same year was Chelsea Clinton. So I got to meet Chelsea Clinton in DC. She was one of the 8 gavel winners. And that's like a major thing if you want to go on to get into the international relations world. But I was split between that and anthropology. I couldn't decide which direction I wanted to go, so I was doing both. Master's degree, I switched to business administration and economics, and I had a dual degree in business administration and economics at University of Delaware. And that was my attempt to be more pragmatic, because my anthropology mentor was like, hey, there's no more jobs. You can't be an anthropology professor, so find something else. I suggest business. And I took her word for it. And then my PhD, I did went to University of Pittsburgh, and I did a PhD in strategic management and business ethics. And my minor, like Angela, was in organizational learning and human cognition. Although my particular focus was essentially on trying to understand learning and communication systems is essentially the same thing as opposed to different things. So transactive memory systems, has anyone ever heard that term? You ever heard of transactive memory? So when you play basketball, so you have 5 people on the squad, right? And what makes you able to do a no-look pass behind your back, and somebody knows exactly on rhythm how to pick that up and then pass it just in time for the other person to put it in the net? Okay, how do you possibly do that, right? you have to have a shared memory of the play and the shared memory of the processes, and you have to know who knows what. It's distributed cognition, right? So it's the idea that memory, learning, cognition are all the same network, and action. And so that organized activity is really about synchronicity. And just like Black, my perspective is always musical. So I'm always thinking in waveforms, in harmonics. And I did my PhD dissertation on a topic called harmonic oscillation theory, which is basically the idea that most complex systems simplify to basic waveforms. So you can basically ignore 98% of the noise and focus on the waveforms, because systems are designed to dampen or accelerate or essentially do various tricks to compress all the irrelevant information, no matter how much there is, into just very simple waveforms. And so sometimes complex systems can be most easily described in a musical way. So so basically, that's sort of a general background that some of you guys don't know about me. But what I'm really looking at doing right now is sort of bringing in a lot of people who have interesting ideas that may be sort of early in stage in their fruition, and seeing if we can kind of weave some of these things together to help each other out, figuring out what our next steps are in our projects, and maybe help other people kick off ideas as we talk. So basically, let's go ahead and Thomas, remind us what the next item up for the.
It was the 5 levels of literacy that you wanted. Okay, so do you want to break that down, how they work and how each are defined?
Sure. There's a lot of different systems you can use to categorize and measure things. This particular system is a social perspective of literacy at a very macro level. So it's more of a sociology of literacy than a how-to of literacy. So for example, basically, if you're thinking about pedagogy, you have K through 12, right? I mean, that's where you would start. And there's already standards for that, and then whatever. But in a more macro sense, we're looking more almost as literacy as a social class phenomenon from ancient times that's still with us today, that has anthropological roots that are even pre-civilizational. But really, the key of civilization was literacy. And I think there's a variety of different factors that created civilization, but the one unifying constant is that you're not only creating surplus value in economics that you're storing so you can scale, but you need a reciprocal form of knowledge to also be able to scale. Resources is one thing, capabilities is another. And on the capabilities side, in order to create civilization, we needed a set of knowledge. And sometimes when we talk about literacy, we think too much about just codifying that. Like, it's reading and writing, right? And that's all there is to it. But it's actually various different levels of understanding and various different levels of complex understanding in how you can apply knowledge to a society, such as the calendars, the celestial calendars that most civilizations had became a basis for literacy systems. You know, you can work down from the stars and understand seasons and rhythms and patterns and cycles. And so that was one source of how some people could understand things. So anyway, ever since the beginning of civilization, we had roughly 5 levels of literacy. Okay. And so you get sort of like this pyramid of social class related to levels of literacy. And you have the informal and the formal. And if you're an informal, then essentially you're a person who's driven to learning on your own independently for various different reasons. Either you're excluded, or it's just simply because you're interested in things that isn't part of your social class. You know, it's like you're a baker, but you want to learn to be a butcher too, you know. So, and then of course there's like the the sort of like exclusive elitist clubs in esoteric literacy, where it's like, well, there's one explanation of how the gods work and how the stars work for the public, for the folk people. And then there's another one for the people who are doing the rituals and the scribing and so forth. And so you can control things and gate it in that way. Well, anyway, translating it into modern times, you have 5 levels of literacy identified by the United Nations in terms of development. So some societies have heavier populations at the top or the bottom, but usually the ones that have heavier numbers of people towards the top have immigrants. So they're drawing people from a level 5 or level 4 literacy pool internationally, which causes brain drain in those other countries. So if all societies have roughly a 2.5% level 5 literacy tendency in its population, but then you're extracting a whole bunch of talents and sending them all to Europe and the United States, then you can appear in sort of a racial profile. You would say, well, the poorer countries have less interest in learning, but really what happens is that they leave. Okay, they go where the books are. And for thousands of years, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, people would go where the books are if that was, their primary motive, right? So civilizations tend to be a literacy attractor. So they tend to be top heavy if they're the most developed, right? For that reason. And so anyway, civilizations also have various types of literacy. It's sort of like what I call knowledge magisteria. And my system is similar to what a lot of people have seen in integralism, except for instead of being it from the inside of a person out, I look at it from the institution down and the shaping of society through those structures, okay? So the basic 6 are similar to integralism, but they're based on anthropology. And so it runs from the erotic era, which all humans went through, the knowledge of family, kinship, relation, things that basically involve the human to human experience before we know much about the world, okay? Like the earliest humans. So we're talking about Paleolithic, early middle Paleolithic type of period. Then the second is animists, and that's where you get spiritual thinking, agental knowledge, right? And a lot of the abstract thinking about how all things are related, not just humans, okay? And that's all encoded in the language of those people and the symbols, right? So then that you have almost universal by at least, I would say 20,000, but maybe as early as 50,000 BC. And between that range, we're talking about universal elements of animism. And that's it. That's the last level of universal experience. Everything past then becomes stratified culturally. And that's where you start having a departure into these levels of literacy into the institutions, right? So then you have the political, okay, the polis, city, urbanization, then the cultural. So you have like the axial age, the great religions and philosophies that abstract that to be divine and not just through a god king intermediary, but straight to the one or the source, okay? Then you have science, obviously, and the scientific revolution is a type of great knowledge magistery that shifted everything. And that becomes its own attractor. And then you have techno-economy, which, although some people like to just say capitalism, I say no, because the left economy was with us since day one. So it's always been a part of that system. It's never been totally or completely not part of it. So to be more general, you say techno-economy, which includes both capitalism and its alternatives within the industrial revolution forward, right? So basically, that also includes all the alternatives to capitalism within industrial. So these are sort of like the types of literacy environments that we can basically develop, right? That are the most broad, most general, easy categories to debate and to discuss. Beyond that, my interest is other people's opinions about their own experiences within these different fields. And if you're polymathic in my mind, it's that you can also quickly adapt to different models and play with them. And, this is a model to be played with, not that it's like a religion for you to join, right? I'm not expecting anyone to join this as if it were a cult. It's just a model. So I was hoping we could then get other people's opinions about the major topics that we were going to cover. So, Thomas, you wanted to start taking people around and asking them a couple questions?
Sure. Do you, I'll start with Benjamin actually, and how it relates to community building and so on. Um, and then we can go from there. So,
Mhm.
uh, Ben, do you want to just break down your knowledge base and experience with building intentional communities, and uh, you can tie it into whatever he was saying, however you like.
Sure. Yeah, I think intentional communities are like a microcosm of the macrocosm that he just spoke to. And so a lot of the same dynamics are at play. It's just kind of at a smaller level. And so, yeah, I'm definitely really passionate about how people can come together in community and how they can, especially how they can make decisions together. And so I don't know if you guys are familiar with something like sociocracy, for example. And so sociocracy is a type of decision-making structure that is not completely non-hierarchical, but it is less hierarchical than, than just having one central leader or like a CEO dynamic that, sits on the stack of everybody below the CEO. It's more like a bunch of concentric circles where all the circles come together to make decisions, and each circle has its own specialty, and each circle has its own people that join the circle depending on what its function is and what its mission is. And so like one circle might be like building, and the other one is farming, the other one is conflict resolution, the other one is finance, things like that. And so I'm definitely really interested in ways that people can come together on the micro level to create their own non-hierarchical or less hierarchical organizations where everybody gets to have more of a say and have more like direct democracy in terms of voting. And yeah, so as far
Can
as
I
like,
ask you a couple questions?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so many places we could go with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll ask you a couple questions to sort of warm it up. The first one would be like, so one of the things that I've discovered in my experience is that there is a collective level. And in fact, I'm more partial to see collectives than individuals, even though I'm highly individualistic, which is it would sound like a paradox, right? But it's essentially simple, where I always see as if the most powerful agent when you start building an organizational system, the agent itself is the collective, whereas we become the resource or the food, for the agent, essentially. If it's well designed, then it actually works that way. In my opinion, I experienced that when it's poorly designed, it collapses down to the individual again, where there's no generally true group agency. Like I said about a transactive memory system, where we know that those people have that covered and we can trust them and we can do the no look pass behind the back to them, right? And so it's that idea of community flow state. So have you been in any places where you thought were closer to flow state than others?
I mean, that's a great question. And I think for me, a lot of it is theoretical, because I have been actually actively looking for communities to join and live in. And I've lived in some collective houses and I've visited communities. But I lived in one this summer, but again, it was a small community. It's hard to find. I've been looking to find and live in one for a long time. And there's a bunch of big examples that are famous, like Tamara in Portugal and Findhorn, things like that. But I'm not going to move to Europe necessarily. For one, I was trying to find one in the States. I had a really hard time. It's actually why I moved to Asheville, was to try to find one. There's Earth Haven there, which is probably the best example of one, but I didn't find a place to like rent or buy there. they can be hard to buy into. They can be hard to both rent. It's hard to find rentals at intentional communities for sure, and it's often hard to find a place to buy as well.
Have you found that the American experience is more like herding cats, like rather than actually finding a flow state? Because my personal experience has been that a lot of the people who are trying to create community in the U.S. are relying on imports. We're relying on people who come from Portugal or Argentina or Chile, places that have actually had a little more success with it, like Joe Brewer's community. Do you know about Joe Brewer?
Yeah, I do know about Joe Brewer. I don't know about the community specifically, but yeah, and I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia and in Bali, Indonesia. I own a business there, and
I'm working there. I haven't been there yet, but I've been working there remotely. Yeah.
Nice.
Reforestation. I forgot to mention that. I'm working for Reforest now, which is they're reforesting in Australia and Indonesia. And the headquarters just recently moved to Bali, and the CEO is one of my best friends. I talk to him probably 5 to 10 hours a week. We play games together and everything. So he wants me to move there, and I'm seriously considering it. But I'm essentially started as sort of I just joined as on the board of directors, and I'm their American ambassador. So I'm going to be representing them in fundraising in the United States.
That's awesome. Yeah, I would love to talk more about that, and also see how I can, maybe jump in a little bit or help out. But yeah, I've spent a lot of time in Bali. I've been there, I think, about 4 times, and I have a team of carvers there that I work with, and so. But anyhow, yeah. But
that's really cool. Yeah. No, that's the thing is that, so I remember 10,000 Villages, that store?
Yeah, it's like an import store for...
I had a couple of friends who worked there, one of them who was a store manager, and it was, the basic premise was supposed to be fair trade imports from handcrafts from around the world.
Right.
And for a while it worked, but then when the buzz dies down, the American consumer gets lazy and they have to keep pushing the limits of what's actually fair, and they start fluffing the shelves with like upper class rich people's art projects, and that's paid for, so they don't need to make any money off of it. So like they've been doing various different, like what I would say unsavory tricks to make it look like it's still working. But I really love the idea of handicrafts still being a real thing. And, unfortunately, there's only so many places in the world where the market is right for it. And so Bali's one of those, I guess.
Yeah, Bali's great. My team of carvers, I mean, they're just the best in the world. It's a whole village of carvers in Bali that are just the best carvers in the world. And then I've got a team that I've been working with for about 14 years now. But yeah, what I wanted to speak to is just going there. The culture is very collectivist, and so Southeast Asia, most of Asia in general, lots of parts of Europe, Indonesia, the culture is collectivist. The families live generationally. You have the kids being raised by the village.
Right. It's not abstract for them at all.
No, I mean, you go visit and it's a family compound, and I've visited these family compounds many times where it's like, you've got 10 or 15 kids running around. You've got all the ibus, which are the mothers, doing their thing. You get the grandmas there. You've got the grandpas. You got all the aunts and uncles and extended family, all living in the same village, all, raising the kids together. And that kind of collectivism is very we oriented, which does transcend the individual. The US is very individual and me oriented, and so it can be really hard to find high functioning intentional communities that are village like communities functioning well here, because it's not really a part of the ethos. It's not what people grow up with, and there is that kind of tension between, where does the individual begin and end, where does the collective begin and end, and it's the dialectical tension between the two. And that is something I'm really fascinated with. And I do think high functioning communities are ones where everybody actually identifies as much with being a community. That's a part of their core identity as they identify with their own individuality. It's important to not lose their individuality, though, so it's about both.
I got one quick point, and then we're going to keep moving. So in my model, one of my claims is that if you build communities in an anthropological fashion from the root up, like I suggested, you start with erotic knowledge that's kinship, family, taboo, the kind of lived thing that you're talking about in Bali, where you build up from the very base of a tribe. Then you have an animist spirit where you basically, when you have a critical mass of that going on, you're going to start seeing the emergent spiritual come out of that, right? Just from the realness of it, right? And then you start saying, well, is it large enough that it gets political, right? And so there seems to be tipping points where those sometimes families become more of a multi-generational dynastic political system, where you have family trusts and family politics. And then, you know what I'm saying, you can even get family religion going. And then you can get, family, when you get into science and techno-economy, you're getting more into business and the idea that these communities can actually have very large, let's say, influential ideas that emerge out of them that affect other communities and so forth, and then also become business. So my thinking is that when you have that kind of harmonic, that's that richer community. If you just take one slice, like just a business community, or you just take, like, we get together and talk nerd shit, a science community, right? Or you focus on only one of those slices at the time, I don't think you're going to get that deep resonance, that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think the deep resonance comes from a shared sense of mission and purpose, a shared cultural identity, a feeling of belonging, and a feeling of love, like actually loving the people in the community. And it's not always going to be that way. Like the shadow stuff's always going to come up. Conflict is always a part of community. Decision making is hard. Trying to have everybody's needs and desires met is not possible, because people have differing needs, differing desires, differing opinions on what should happen or how things should go regarding decisions. And so, yeah, I mean, it's to me, it's that it's trying to then come back to that flow state, come back to that shared, like, yeah, we're all in this together. And then there's like little perturbations or disruptions in the field where it's like, okay, there's this conflict over here, or there's this decision needs to be made over here that people don't exactly know, how to have to figure it out. And then a good system is actually is to continue that flow state. A good system will be the best one that can help people make those decisions and also help people resolve the conflict. Those the two, that's why I'm fascinated by systems that can help do that, because there's always going to be decisions that need to be made. There's always going to be conflict. How do you return to a flow state in that with that? So yeah.
Do you want to kick it to Black at this point? I think one of the things we've talked about a lot is the difficulty of online communities being coherent anymore, that there was sort of like an early wave where people who jumped in the early part of the internet had a different sort of experience and a different sort of optimism about what we could create out of online communities. But then sort of like everybody showed up and crashed the party, and that keeps happening as a cycle. I don't know, man. I think we've encountered a lot of the tension between the individual and the group, and sort of the difficulty of doing anything rich or meaningful in that context.
Yeah. So when I hear you talking about literacy, there's so much there, especially in contrast to like what incentivizes. Okay, so like I like to listen to Daniel Gardner from OG Rose, and I like to think about the philosophical side of what incentivizes people. Now, this might it can land as sometimes kind of extreme. And it's interesting because I feel like I've always been in this position. Even since I was, and I think I might have mentioned this to you in our other conversation, even when I was really young, I had this thing where if I'm asking my mom a question or the adults, I'm asking them a question, and I was never satisfied with this answer of, oh, well, it's just the way it is, especially when it came to like, global conflicts and religious conflicts. I was like, no, there has to be a source. Like I was always interested in finding what's the meat under the thing, like what's the actual source, what's the reason behind it. And when you break down a lot of what's happening, and I know that, Robert, you know a lot about the history and the anthropology and the ways in which religion, off and all these different types of things. And when you break a lot of this down, there is this sort of philosophical and this metaphysically philosophical nature to that which inspires us and that which incentivizes us. And I think that the difficulty here, and especially when you talk about literacy and the levels of literacy, the difficulty here is trying to get people to to care about the better sides of their opportunity and the better sides of what's possible, while there's this sort of addiction and inclination of looking at the worst sides of what's actually happening too, because it's all happening at the same time. Like Tristan Harris often talks about how we don't have a biological like receptor to say, okay, here's like a beautiful woman online. Oh, I like that. Here's a guy who disagrees with my political debate. I don't like that. Oh, here's somebody getting bombed in another. It's like all just back and forth at once because the social media platforms are just incentivized to kind of keep it going crazy.
Right,
So when
talking past each other, right? Whole lot of talking past each other using different linguistic styles, different structures, different goals, different aims. And so you have these sort of open battle royales of communication, right?
Yeah. And so this is the way, again, that this is pretty much the only way that I can orient myself now around what you're saying about different levels of media literacy, because I know that you are framing it in a way that is inspired by coherence. You want it to be adaptable and understandable in what's in the approach. So through that, I can understand it. And the thing that keeps coming up for me is that, and this is just, and I don't want to go off and make it worse, but like in TikTok, something kept coming up just called, they kept talking about media literacy. And this, of course, the recursive nature in the way that, because there's an order to things, it might start off where somebody who is an academic proposes something, and then all of a sudden it gets fucked up by TikTok, and next thing you know, people who don't know what they're talking about are feeding it back in. But the media literacy thing, because of my orientation around art, is something that kept coming up. And so this is really where I throw a wrench in the whole thing when it comes to like art and stuff like that, is because the way I understand the way in which we inform our aspirations through the media, like through the better aspects of the media. So, movies and stuff can be a great example. A movie that carries a positive message but is also educational. This can be artistic, but can inspire so many people, can change so many lives. And often that gets kind of brushed under the rug, and it gets kind of looked at like, oh, okay, kind of the whole artists aren't that important thing. And they gets put in this frame of in people's blind spots. They forget how much a song meant to them or how much a movie inspired them, because, they're not really involved in it. So the separation between something like the artist and the person who enjoys the art, because the person who enjoys it is not an artist, is very similar to, the science of something like, you know, quantum computing or something gets completely appropriated by, I'm just going to use an example, like a Deepak Chopra. He turns it into a new age thing, and he starts talking about quantum physics. Like, so the thing I'm saying is that the separation, I recently called it, God, what did I call it? Something dimensional, can't remember the term, but the thing is that right now we are always one step away from somebody else's complete dimension, a mimetic ecology of everything that they're involved in. We're one step away. If I was to say, you know what, I just found this guy named Robert Conan, and I read about 5 minutes of his stuff, I don't think he has any idea what he's talking about. All I have to do is go, wait, let me ask him. Let me immerse myself in what he's talking about for an hour or whatever, you know, read some of the articles, whatever. And then now I'm informed. The inclination is to say, even though this other dimension is right next to me, I don't have the inclination to peek into that dimension. And this is where...
Right. There's no motivation for you to take the next step because you're coming at it in a combative or competitive frame of mind. The assumption that anybody I don't resonate with right away, if we don't have mirroring in our language, if we don't strike the same chord, if we don't have, we do shit tests of each other, right? So, you know, Trump tests and, you know, like, are you into the environment tests? And, you know, or, you know, it like, you know, on the right, they call it virtue signaling, but I think the better word on sort of a centrist way to start is shit tests. We're just always shit testing each other. And so basically, like, also, like you said, there's always that motivation for like a reinterpretation. So it's like, I'm happy to borrow something that you have to share with me, but I'm going to put it back in my framework, such as the framework I just gave you guys at the beginning of the conversation, where it's like, well, this is about me. It's my conversation. So we're all going to play Robert's game and Robert's framework, right? And then so it happens is a lot of people try to stake the flag down and be like, you know, come into my Substack, you know, join my community, you know, translate your words into ours. Like, we want to use our language, you know.
So the way I see that showing up in like media spaces is what starts to happen is there's this weird ego smashing, in the same way they talk about you know, a mystical experience or something like that. That starts to happen, and in the same way people are kind of adverse to that. If they go to a real therapist who says, hey, you know, you need to leave that toxic relationship behind, and they say, no, let me just, and they keep bargaining to try to do the toxic thing. In that same way, there's an aversion to adaptation to the collective. I've noticed this in a lot of different ways through different people over time, but there becomes an aversion to exactly what you're talking about. Okay, I'm gonna do the steel manning thing. You know, and this is also why I like Dave Snowden so much, is he talks about kind of steel manning and this triopticon idea as a new standard of saying, you know, you can't debate against someone unless you know what they're talking about. So you have to be able to steel man to prove that you know what they're talking about. And so I think that there's an aversion, and it's honestly, I think, a fear, like a deep-seated fear in people that, well, if I really have a conversation with this guy, or I see what he's presenting and it's not the thing I thought and it challenges my belief, then, you know, I'll lose something of myself, or I'll lose the game somehow. There's this weird like atmosphere of that going around. And inversely, obviously, the only thing that's going to get us to the value that we all say that we're striving for is actually the danger, you know. And I keep saying it's like this sexiness, it's like this the thing that people really want is actually to immerse themselves in the thing and not know what the fuck is going to happen or where it's going. And the way in which Zach Stein frames the separation between generations, I believe that what is emerging is, as those generations separate and then attempts are made for them to reconcile, what is happening is it is becoming a very universally attractive, sexy, like erotic almost thing of, you know what I want to do now, since the computer and the social media has taken everything down this train and it put bumpers on everything. I am so fucking bored now that I want to go into this space of these other people. And if we can sort of coerce that and make sure it's done for the sake of it and not done for a profit, because an AI can easily, somebody can make an AI that profits off the chaos of that, but endlessly. But if we can make sure that it's not incentivized in that way, we could then say, okay, coming back to the Jamie Wheel thing about stealing, we have the ability to enter these worlds and shake ourselves out of our space and kind of shake up our ego a little bit. But it's not being done in a purely contrarian troll way where it's like, I just want to destroy you for the hell of it, and then I'm going to go destroy somebody else. It's done in a way that sees a coherence in the whole kind of, a different telos to the whole thing where there's a meaning behind it. I once said that it was like, conceptually, I saw it as, I said red pill ads forever, where I said, what happens when a Nike or some company does the edgiest media you've ever seen, and everybody says, well, they're definitely going to get canceled, but then they just don't get canceled from it. And then everyone starts to look for this thing that is not, the PC thing with all the bumpers on it. And I think that that's just a hurdle that we have to kind of get across, of allowing ourselves to be uncomfortable in the frameworks of political and social and even spiritual intentionally, so that we can collaborate better on like a higher frequency. So that's the way I understand it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to some of that around conflict online. I really like the way John Vervaeke frames it, which is like good faith opponent processing. And the thing that's really tough about the online conversation spaces is it's just happening in the text threads and the comments. You're not seeing the person in front of you. It's not even a video call. And then you're not with them in person. And when we're with somebody in person, we're much more inclined to read them emotionally and to assume that their intentions are better. And right. we kind of enter it with like a good faith, predisposition. But online, it's like you're just reading somebody's comments. So, yeah, and the worst of humanity often comes out just through text, because they're hiding behind a screen, and it's just, you can say whatever you want. But in order to actually,
it also magnifies the autistic in everyone.
Yeah.
In everyone.
And just taking everything super literally, super logically, just like honing in, on the argument. And when, as you were saying, like, you have to kind of lean into being open and steel man the person's argument, first off, like really get to understand it, and being open to changing your own opinion if proper evidence is given to support the changing of your opinion. And so both people actually have to enter into this good faith opponent processing process by being open to the conversation, changing and sifting their perspectives if it's reasonable to do so. And that actually takes like really surrendering one's ego and surrendering their identity around their beliefs, and being open to changing and adapting their beliefs in a conversation with somebody else. And that's pretty rare,
I'm curious where Angela's going to take this next. Thomas, I think we should give her plenty of time to riff, because we made her wait.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
She's sort of like saving the best for last, because she's probably the central expert on tying the theme of literacy, community, and then, of course, polymathic thinking, which is sort of like the triangles we've been drawing here. So
yeah, I'd love to comment. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I just Googled it. I was like, what is the actual definition of literacy? Because I want to get back to that. Literacy is the ability to read, write, speak, and listen in a way that allows people to communicate effectively and make sense of the world. So yeah, I think we've touched upon a really important skill, which is, can you actually not just have like that top to intellectual range, the capacity to have learned broadly and deeply, but can you change your mind? Intellectual range is not the same as intellectual flexibility. And you don't want to be overly flexible where
Right.
like any idea comes by and you just believe it. You want to think critically for yourself. You even want to think critically about your own interiority, not just out there. You want to question, how did I even form my own beliefs? You know, was I programmed with them? But the fact is that knowledge is power. Intelligence fixes so much. And our world has a lot of issues that are problematic. There's large swaths of humans still suffering in poverty and disease and lack, and intelligence can fix so much, especially with AI here. So knowledge is power. It fixes so much. But even with the top 2% intellectually gifted, as in your model, the most literate at the level 5, well, we have smart people all over the world, and we still have a meta crisis. That hasn't fixed our problems, has it? So then the question becomes, well, what's next? Like, okay, we got smart people, but we got huge complex problems. What now? And so what I think we need to ask ourselves next is, well, what do you do when you have problems so big and so complex that you don't know how to solve them? You've never done it before. What do you do? And to me, the obvious answer is, well, you have to learn your way there to new solutions. We don't know how to solve the meta crisis. We don't know how to fix humanity's problems. So we're going to have to learn. But no one of us, even the most genius amongst us, can't figure it out. There's 8 billion perspectives. And even the top 2%, oh, by the way, as smart as some of us may be, I think it's really important for us to understand the other 98%'s perspectives, right? So we can think really holistically. So
that was the original justification for the 2%, is to serve the 98%, not to bully them. The Brahmin classes, the shamanic classes were public servants, and so they were supposed to think about themselves as having the greatest burden, not the greatest privilege.
Absolutely. That's my favorite kind of polymath genius, is the kind that uses their talents for the betterment of others. They use their gifts to be of service. So, okay, I think we could probably all agree, well, yeah, we do need to learn our way to new solutions. This is part of why I believe so much in polymathy, because it's many learnings. It's seeing life as an exploration of learning. How can I learn about this and learn about that and be a weirdo and not conform and not fit in boxes and not be predictable and be really original and express my ownness and therefore have mind sovereignty and not be totally owned and programmed from the outside? Because then we're no different from the robots, are we? We're programmed with our genetics, our DNA. We're programmed with our education. We're programmed with our media, our social expectations. So I really feel like part of why we're here on a human journey, just to bring it back to the spiritual, and oh, by the way, one of my favorite rabbit holes to go down is to watch near-death experience accounts. I've watched so many of them. And what a common trend and a common theme among people who have died and come back, and they've gone to the realm of light and love and unity. The point of this human experience is to learn. It's the Earth School. And also, part of what we do in the life review, a really important critical common theme in the life review, is we understand what we did and said from the perspective of others we impacted. So it seems like we experience time and cause and effect. So we can learn how we're part of a larger being, we're part of a larger existence, and what we do to others, we're going to feel like we're doing it to ourselves. So learning is central to why we're here. Learning fixes so much, but our individual geniuses can't fix our world. So then the obvious next step is, well, we need to collectively learn and collectively sense make. Like, that's the next step. And yes, there's the meta modern, there's the integral, there's the new age. the liminal web, the complexity people. There's all these names. We're all kind of swimming in the same sea of thinkers,
Right.
but we're disconnected still.
Highly.
Yes. And so I think that's our next challenge is like, okay, the 2% top literacy, like so we are familiar with each other. We're all thinking, we're not just downloading, we're really cogitating. We're thinking as verb, as action, as awakened consciousness. We're all consciousness.
Yeah. So I'm going to say something real quick and bounce it right back. You get bonus time because we put you at the end, so you're going to get plenty of time. So one thing I've used as a concept is that you have sort of like the formal and the informal, right, in learning, okay? And you have the formal and then informal in society. And obviously formal learning is for formal society typically, and informal learning is usually for both. So that's why I say informal levels like the erotic and the animist are universal, because regardless of any formal systems, we're all going to do it. We're Homo sapiens, right? And so we essentially become verbally literate and experientially literate at those levels without any hierarchical bureaucratic systems guiding us, but then when you get into that formal, you get a different pattern. And that's where I say, institutional patterns like political, religious, cultural, scientific, and techno-economic, they become sort of like attractors for the institution rather than institutions for the person. So basically you sort of have things move to like a superhuman attractor level, and we become the food, and the ant colony basically no longer serves the ants that build it, and so the stigmergic concept I was using there, but basically so my thought here, Angela, is that basically again some of these things we're talking about, the parallel, I say, in the Brahmin class, every early civilization had a Brahmin class. They had their own word for it. The Mandarin class in China, for example, they weren't all equally ranked at the top. Sometimes they were second in power or third, or they oscillated in power socially. But in general, the Brahmin class was not driven by material excess, wealth, or power. That was usually more of a warrior or merchant class thing to do. But there was the inside and the outside. And my claim is that a lot of polymathic behavior comes from what I call the visionary Brahmins. And the visionary Brahmins are the ones who are the visionary types. They're a little disruptive because they still have an animist spirit to what they're doing. They haven't totally given up on the outside of the institution, right? And so they tend to, a visionary Brahmin type tends to be, in my mind, a polymath autodidact in the wild. And that's a person who usually has unique, quirky, doesn't fit in boxes, visions, inspirations, relations. You see a lot of neurodivergence in that space that make people hyper creative, hyper artistic. They even struggle with words, just like Black was saying earlier about struggling with the idea of being an artist and becoming the artist like Prince and something like that. We all become an avatar of a certain kind in order to gain more power. We have to establish which avatars we're playing and pour energy into becoming that. But the difference is that when you're a visionary Brahmin, you're sort of like, again, more of the bohemian type, the scattered. You tend to be very difficult to herd cats that are geniuses because they've got so much going on and nobody can fit in anyone else's system perfectly. I can't force any one of you into my box, It's much easier to relate when you all have avatars within the system and you do the formal thing. And so if you're a formal Brahmin, it's almost the opposite experience. You're the regulator, you're the law, you're the orthodoxy, And that's one of the most uneasy tensions that I've seen in my life is between the inside Brahmin and the outside Brahmin, or what I call the visionary versus, the orthodoxy. So I wanted to kick that back to you and see where that takes you.
Yeah, I think that's our challenge. Like what we've been tap dancing around already is like, can we maintain curiosity and can we keep learning while we feel like we know anything at all? Like if I know, can I continue to learn? That's the challenge. That's the stretch. Another thing I wanted to touch upon is a little bit more on consciousness. Because I actually remember a lot of my life, like a little bit better than most people, apparently. Like I remember being 2, and I remember being 4 and 5 and 6. And, like I remember what my consciousness felt like. And then I can look back and, think of myself now at nearly 45. And I can understand that the quality of my consciousness is different now because I've read a lot, I've thought a lot, I've listened a lot, I've exercised my brain. And I've also freed my brain enough to think independently and to create new insights too, to not just repeat, but to see, to really see. And so for me, part of what makes learning so amazing as like a way of understanding the human experience, as a journey of learning, of becoming, is that for me, it feels like it runs in parallel. I don't know if it causes the increasing of my consciousness, or if the increasing of my consciousness helped me learn, or what it was, but they're parallel tracks. Like the more I wake up my mind through learning, the more conscious I feel, the more I feel like I can create new ideas actually. And so I've experienced this at an individual level, like the slow awakening of my consciousness coming more online the older I've gotten and the more I've learned. And I consider myself like a thought artist in a way. And I think the next phase for humanity is the collective consciousness somehow awakening. And the challenge is, how do we organize to make that happen?
Angela,
and AI is probably part of that.
There's a question. I don't want to take it off in a different direction too much, but there's just something that I wanted to ask personally, which is, so this is interesting, like talking about remembering like early life experiences and stuff like that. Do you feel, okay, so this can be kind of redundant because it's recursive, because if you are remembering your early childhood from your consciousness now, it might frame it as if it was the same. But I'm wondering, when you remember your early childhood, do you feel as if there was a consciousness in the spiritual term where your early childhood essence in that sort of metaphysical way? Do you feel like your sentience, like as a child, do you remember it as being ultimately the same, like you as an essence, or did it seem completely different back then?
It's yes and no. It's like both. It's very meta modern. Okay, my consciousness was simpler. My consciousness back then observed and received, and that was about it. Like I experienced, but I wasn't that awake. I wasn't fully alert. The lights weren't all the way on. But I think there probably was some essence of my personhood, the goodness in my heart, the wanting to be a good girl, some flavor of my soul that was there. So I'm like, I was me, but I wasn't as awake a version or authentic a version, because I was new. I was brand new in the Angela avatar, experiencing being human, and I was mostly just going with the flow.
So you're saying, okay.
Go ahead, Thomas.
Oh, so you're saying that it's not just the contents of consciousness that changed, but the actual nature of consciousness itself changed? Or was the underlying consciousness, would you say, the same, but the contents just complexified? They were simpler before, and now they're more complex? Or would you say the nature of your consciousness is different now?
I think it's all of that somehow all at once. Like my consciousness could observe, my consciousness could feel back then when it was simpler. My consciousness could experience, but it was just much more basic. It wasn't as developed. It wasn't as thoughtful. It wasn't as introspective. It wasn't as well read. My literacy was lower. I mean, I would have been like a level 1 literacy when I was a little kid. My vocabulary was limited. The exercise in my brain. My brain wasn't even fully developed. But oh, by the way, I don't think consciousness comes from the brain. Like I think our consciousness exists. We're light, energetic, conscious beings of some kind, it seems, even though it sounds bizarre. It's bizarre we're here. So it's already bizarre. There's going to be more bizarre. We got to be
We're a
open
field of some sort. In other words, it's not just specifically located in a center, right?
It's not created from the brain. It's funneled through it temporarily.
Right.
Limits
So, the idea of a complex adaptive system of which we're basically on the edge of rather than the center is my way of conserving. So what I feel is like my sense of identity is that I'm channeling things. Things move through me, and I observe them, and so a very large percentage of what goes through me, I'm actually passively observing. Right? It's the flow of information that is all the information from all the experiences I've gathered talking to you and other people. It's always there. There's always some trace of it.
The unconscious, I think, is like 90% of the processing power of the brain, anyways. So
Right.
What if consciousness is a singular universal phenomenon? And
that's panpsychism, but yeah, what's that?
It's decentralized, like neurons in a brain are still part of the brain, or like a drop is the ocean and the ocean's in the drop. But it seems to me like intelligence, consciousness, awareness exists, has decentralized, and the trouble is we haven't properly reintegrated. So decentralization without the reintegration breaks things down. And I think that's kind of the root of the brokenness of our earth, is that we've made our in-groups and our out-groups and our perspectives, and we've decentralized and we've otherized, and we assume difference means you're wrong rather than, wait, we're all part of the same singular being or phenomenon or experience. And there's a lot I can learn from the others.
For sure. And that's how I think we actually transcend game A, zero-sum game, competitive dynamics and enter into a more game B, omni-win, cooperative, pro-social way of being, is through a collective identity shift towards all identifying as one collective, human family, one collective human consciousness. We're all sharing much more similarities than we are differences, and it's important to try to really experience that and identify with that. Is that sort of the collective awakening that you were speaking to?
Yeah, somehow. And I think, the age of Aquarius is like hints at that, and I don't know that much about it, but I just know there's that song,
Right.
The age of Aquarius.
Yeah, and I'm really passionate. Go on.
Turtle. That's our next stage of development.
For sure, I agree with that. I'm really passionate about that, and what I'm passionate about is actually grounding in like the ideal of that, because a lot of like conscious, spiritually awake people have been like feeling that and channeling that, globally for a long time, and I enter into those spaces a lot. And it's like, yes, that's true. And that's actually not enough, though, to have like really good high functioning communities or high functioning civilizations. You actually need both. You can't just have the idea of like, yeah, but we're all just one big human global family. Like everything should just work out well because I feel that in my body. It's actually just organize. You have to actually be really good at organizing around that. Like, yes, that's the thread that carries it through, but there needs to also be really good and well-designed systems. It's both.
Exactly. And I think this was one of the fundamental fractures in the Game B community, as far as I understand it, is that it was like, do we change our individual selves and then we make the world a better place, or do the systems and structures really impact what individuals can do? And it's both. Like we have to take responsibility for our individual lives, and we're also need to take responsibility for the structures impacting how we show up.
Right.
And if I could just say too, I want to really give a shout out. I spam it kind of a lot, but I really thought it was good. Was Tim from Voicecraft had a little series he had called Cultural Shamanism with Layman. I think Layman Pascal was in there for a little while, or did it 1 or 2 videos. It's Layman Pascal and then Daniel Gardner from OG Rose, who I've talked about. But the way in which he was able to frame, and it was interesting because he did this series right before he had a back and forth with Dave Snowden, and Dave Snowden came down as kind of this Saturnian, like, fatherly, like, okay, like, that's all sounds great, but you got to get your shit together if you're going to do that sort of figure. It was interesting, but because Dave Snowden even pushed back on him using the term shaman, because Snowden was like, hey, I've been around shamans and I've seen the way that word has been appropriated. You shouldn't even use the word. So basically it was like a challenge of, are you mature enough, and are you really called? Do you think you can reform again your own identity and the collective identity in such a way to even use that word? And I think that the methods and the inspirations that they had in how they framed collective shamanism was accurate, and it was about what we are talking about and what Angela just said about the existential crisis in game B that came through when people realized, okay, wait a minute, and am I working on myself, or am I working on the collective, or can I work on myself without the collective, and vice versa? And one thing that I wanted to paint just as a felt sense of, so I started artistically with the Telecatron project, calling it a solar pirate. And the solar pirate was basically somebody who could see the abundance that we actually have in all of our opportunities realistically, and then coerce people to lean more into the abundant side of things rather than that lack. And one felt sense example I can give, and again, this is more of an artistic idea, but recently in Chicago, there's been these mass uprisings of like teenagers basically just completely taking over the streets, and there's nothing anyone can do about it.
Takeovers, yeah.
Here's the problem is that a lot of them are out there just smoking weed and racing cars and doing hoodlum shit. But the point is, when we think back to what we were talking about the online spaces and saying, if I don't like socialism, but I've never actually read about it, but my buddy has read all about it, and I just choose not to go in his dimension, what a weird space it is to not step into that dimension. That's a click away. It's just one click away. And the bizarre thing about these kids in Chicago is like, when they're organizing and they don't even realize it. They're collectively moving, and they're doing it just to get high and just to mess with the parents basically, and to defy the police. But they're one step away from a completely revolutionary act where they could do anything. They could organize in the way that like Benjamin's talking about, and they're one step away from, like I said, whatever culturally or whatever artistically the influence is on them to say, hey, you guys all have phones and you could organize to get high and screw around the street. Why couldn't you organize to vote or do something else? So like I said, I'm just saying that to show the more of the felt sense, but also the difficulty in what we talk about when we talk about the individual versus the collective, and not wanting to disrupt and not wanting to step out and do these things.
I want to jump in really quick because that was so on point to what I was hoping to hear from you on that, because I knew we'd kind of come to the same point on that. So the levels of literacy thing. So imagine you're working with pre-institutional knowledge. Okay, it's in your DNA. It's in your heritage. Okay, you've got this erotic and this animist energy, right? You're youthful. You're attracted to certain things, but you don't know anything yet. You've got minimal literacy about it, but you've got a hunger, and you're bringing all that energy into a space, right? And you just bring tons of erotic energy and just barely bringing into that animus level. I'm smoking weed and I'm starting to think ideas, and I'm starting to connect and relate to lots of things. And then you're saying, well, spontaneously, if the right things were fed into it, knowledge, structure, you could create something that then grows and even possibly emerges as an institution, a bureaucracy, which is exactly how the Black Spades started. If you guys know about the Black Spades in New York City and the rise of the street gangs in the United States, that actually came prior. There were two separate models. Street gangs, you're talking about the long history going back thousands of years of the underworld gangs, motivated by satanic Luciferian concepts, motivated by secret society of a dark perspective. Once you get in, you can't get out, and we're going to do bad things, but we're going to all go to rich, and then we'll go to hell. Well, piracy, those sorts of ancient things. But you have a separate force, and that's the organizational force. You could flip that switch so easily into a community movement, an organization, right? And so the Black Spades, so most of the earliest gangs were very much, the Crips and the Bloods were very much more of the criminal type from their foundation. But there was a counterforce within minority communities to build street organizations, and they don't want anyone to call them a gang, right? You don't call us a gang, we're a street organization. And some of the founders of that basically became the founding of hip hop. The Black Spades, the Seven Immortals, the Savage Nomads, some of these organizations in New York City, and even some of them began as criminal, but they made flip the switch. And it's one of the best sociological studies of the 20th century. If you guys have not gotten into that, talking about how do you take that energy and turn it into something, right? The first thing they did is they brought labor union energy. They said we all want jobs,
Yeah.
but we want jobs our way. We're not trying to go through that meat grinder and fail. Like, we're not trying to do that. We want to start building some sort of practical street energy up to create work and to create activities that are not going to put us right into the system for life, and that's where a lot of hip hop came from, was alternatives to that. But they did a lot of labor union stuff. So the early hip hop organizers got together and created informal labor unions. So everybody would get each other a job, and they would do takeovers of supermarkets, not to rob them or smash them, but to improve them. They would go, this is real true story, food deserts in New York City in the 60s and 70s. They invaded organizations and filled them with talent instead of breaking them down and creating a sort of informal labor union that eventually negotiated to become a semi-formal with the city. So Black Spades were all over Safeway, like, basically. And so all these street organizations found positive angles and business models and ways to get back into institutions in a way that worked. But in the current time, we're seeing break energy, not build energy. And those are the algorithms those are the signals that are getting magnified as anger and break. People sometimes don't understand why I'm so Antifa, and I said it's because of this. I'm a build anarchist, not a break anarchist. And you can flip that switch, and it's the exact opposite outcome.
Yeah, and I identify that like, that's my journey. Like, I started being super angry at the system at a really young age, like drinking a ton of alcohol, partying a ton. I've been a musician my whole life, so I was in touring bands. I've played huge shows. I've done a lot with music also myself, and for a long time it was like punk rock and metal and angry. It was break energy with that. And then I had cancer in my early 20s and almost died, and then I shifted towards taking better care of myself and my body, and then shifting towards build energy, heal energy, regenerative energy. And the thing is so much of our culture isn't actually rooted in that. I didn't learn how to do that until my 20s, and it was only because I got to know like a fringe small culture of people who were doing that. Everyone else in the mainstream culture where I grew up, and where most people grew up, is party energy, self-deprecation energy, drugs, alcohol, video games, porn, fighting. It's like we have to shift. The majority of our culture in the U.S. is that, and so it's actually
the erotic base and the erotic break as opposed to erotic build.
Yeah.
So it's like hitting all those basic pre-civilizational instincts and pulling them out and pushing them into pornography and drugs and negative without a roadmap. and it never becomes animist. You can't take it from erotic to animist if you don't have mentorship, because
That's
you
what
have
that's what I
lost all
needed.
wisdom.
Yeah, that's what we all needed, was some
Right.
form of mentorship and a positive role model to help lift you out of that. Yeah.
Can I add a perspective here as well?
Mhm.
So I think it's something like 98% of our genetics we share with chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are aggressive and territorial. So we're like part animal, and I think we're part divine consciousness. And I think
Mhm.
the challenge ahead of us is how can we step into our higher selves individually and collectively more. And the fact of the matter is, we're all dying. We're all dying. I mean, maybe the transhumanists will Ray Kurzweil will have the longevity escape velocity in a few years. We'll reverse age and we'll live longer. But at
Brian
some point,
Johnson.
like our meat suits do die.
Yeah.
And so the fact of the matter is, like, we're literally like on a tiny little planet in a vast cosmos, eating other life forms to survive until we die. And we've been territorial and aggressive because it's in our genetics, probably.
And it's also just game theory, but game
Yeah.
theory predisposes us to where it's like, once I went on a huge deep dive into game theory, I was like, oh, that explains like 95%. Like if you study like the evolution of humans and evolution of civilization and all of that, and just war dynamics and colonialism dynamics and all of that, it's like, it's just game theory, the majority of it. And transcending game theory is going to be, I don't know if we can. It's going to have to be a both include and transcend, like a very integral meta-modern thing. But if we can include and transcend game theoretical dynamics, I will have some hope for humanity to actually evolve into some sort of next era where we can start to see civilizations organize around something different. If we can't include and transcend game theory, it's just going to be a repeat of what we were seeing, just on and on and on. And I'm curious if anybody has anything to say to that.
I don't know a ton about game theory, but I'm guessing it's like, we compete and like that's in our nature. Is it roughly?
It's that. Go on. I was just going to say multipolar traps and arms races are really important to understand, but maybe Robert has something he wants to add. If not, I can explain those briefly, but yeah.
It's when you have a payoff structure that can never find the ideal or the best condition. In other words, you can never have the best of all possible worlds. And the major reason that you cannot reach that payoff structure is because the game is decided that the risks are greater to pursue the highest cooperative outcome. The risks, in other words, the cynical approach, what we call the defector approach, is Machiavellian. It's basically to say there's a it's sort of like lower risk, higher reward relatively in the short run. And then in the long run, that would reverse if everybody all agrees to play by the rules. So if we all play by the same game, we all play cooperatively in that game, we have the best of all possible worlds. But the thing is, there's so many things that can throw us off that harmony and get us into the downward spiral, the multipolar traps, basically.
Yeah. Basically, if we all get together collectively and agree that we're going to try to co-create some kind of harmonious, experiment civilizationally, we can actually use coordination to start to really lift everyone up in a good way. The issue is that the world is an anarchy of states, right? And so all of the different countries are actually positioned against one another to try to optimize their own position in terms of resources and money and all of that. And they're actually in that sort of oppositional environment. It behooves them to assume the worst about their opponent. So we have to, like, our military has to always preemptively assume that other militaries are building nuclear weapons or increasing their military.
Everybody's cheating on the rules. Nobody's following the contract.
Yeah, you have to assume that everybody's cheating, and because you're doing that, you're in arms races. So everybody's in these multipolar trap arm races where you're assuming the worst about your opponents. You're continuing to build your army and your military, and you're continuing to assume the worst is going to happen. And when that happens, everything just starts to get shittier for everybody. Like the U.S. now is $1.5 trillion propose to go towards the military. It's like that is a massive amount of money to go towards it. Why? Because of multipolar traps and global hegemony and all that kind of stuff. And
yeah, you want to talk about hegemony? Thomas and I will be covering a lot of that in our work.
Nice.
Yeah.
But basically one thing, and then you can jump in. I just wanted to say, so hegemony naturally emerges because you need basically an arbiter, and so that in civilizational history, the hegemonic power essentially assumes the highest privilege, but also assumes the highest burden, and that it becomes cyclical because the privilege always exhausts itself, and it eventually becomes a net return on investment. And everybody wants to put arrows in their back eventually. And then you have an auto collapse, and then you have to build a new consensus and a new central authority. And so that's sort of,
Yeah, and that's within still game-made dynamics, where there has to be some hierarchical central.
That is game-made dynamics.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so if there is no, say, like, coordination between all nations, where it's like a UN but way better and way higher functioning, and we could actually in theory have a world where we don't have war anymore. The only way to transcend war, though, is to transcend game theoretic dynamics, multipolar traps, arms races, assuming that you have to always be prepared for somebody who's going to default. It's really difficult to ever achieve that without some sort of global surveillance, because you have to like check and make sure that, Iran isn't secretly building nuclear weapons and they're just going to ruin it for everybody, right? Like if everybody's like, yeah, let's put away all of our weapons, let's disband our militaries, we're not going to have war anymore, then the issue is all it takes is one person defaulting on that in secret, and then it ruins it for everybody, and they become the new global hegemony, totalitarian power. And so it's almost like that's too costly a risk to take. So then this global collectivism becomes, as you were saying initially, it's like a risk thing. It's too risky to assume that we could all actually ever possibly choose to not be at war.
Yeah,
and that's
war permanently. Yeah.
What's
So
that?
how much of this is tied to men being in charge, though? Like,
no, it's
I'm
not.
sorry.
Women would have the same gear.
That's a great question. No, it's a good question. It's just been heavily
territorial protectors. They, and then they're in charge. Like they're the leaders, they're the CEOs, they're the presidents, and
they repeat the same pattern. Margaret Thatcher is Margaret Thatcher,
Yeah, I want to hear Angela. Angela, I want to hear what you're saying, but I have thought. Sounds like there's multiple. Game theory transcend genders, but I'm curious if you think there's some way it could not. It would be different. But go on.
I think when women, like I have a daughter, I've given birth. I know the toll it takes to create life. Mm-hmm. And I just think it's ridiculous that governments are in the business of murdering humans.
That's terrible.
And by the way, I worked in government for 15 years. I lived near Washington, D.C. I studied America's criminal justice system very deeply. I study the education system very deeply. I consider myself a government reformer. And I think the deeper question under all we're saying, we can organize in bureaucratic governments. We've got 195 nations in the world. We can organize in street gangs. We can organize in all different kind of ways. But what the question before us is, how could humanity organize more intelligently so all humans could have their basic needs met? So we could solve the meta crisis. What would organizing in that way look like? The old systems are crumbling. It was predicted. Kurzweil et al. We need to understand and learn more to fix the problems of our time. We are interconnected and we are individual. One of the things I wanted to say back to literacy just real quick is we're thinking about literacy at the individual level or like in groups of people, but you could also think about our systems and institutions, what level of literacy, of learning, reading, writing, creating, listening, communicating, flexing, adjusting, like what level of literacy do our systems have? And as long as we've organized ourselves into 195 in-groups and out-groups, also called countries. And those countries are mostly organized in bureaucratic format. And bureaucracy was intentionally designed to slow shit down. And now we live in a world of hyper complexity and artificial intelligence. Well, like the systems we have just are not designed for the demands of our time.
Bottom. Go on. Yeah, sorry.
The question is, how do we reorganize? And that's what we need to figure out.
I've been studying that for a while now, but if anybody else wants to chime in, but I've got a few things to say for sure.
Go ahead, Benjamin, and then I'll chime in. Okay, wait. Who wants to go first?
Black, and then Benjamin, and then Thomas will wrap it up. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is weird, but like, so when Robert talked about this sense of the animist or the intuitive or the natural, and then he said, if you first start with the sense, the intuitive, the natural, the animist, and then you move from there into a more cerebral literacy, it actually only goes one way, because now you just have your cerebral literacy under the anime. It kind of feeds into itself. And I think that part of what's so difficult about this is that I started to think that watching all this stuff in Game B for so long, I watched everything about the meta crisis. I've listened to everybody I could, and then even contrarians and stuff. And what I started to find was, like, for example, with the game theory thing, I think a lot of what I see is a very specific loss of faith that follows these esoteric lines and the spiritual and religious lines throughout history of what it actually means to have faith and what it means to lose faith in something. So with this multipolar trap and with the game theory thing, like, it's this bizarre thing where it's like, we're never going to lose. Like, it's so bizarre. It's like, we're never going to lose. Like, playing games are fun. All right. And so this is part of how I understand game theory and the development of human beings as they play games and they compete, and then they learn about themselves and each other. And again, when you're doing it in a friendly competition, it can be the greatest thing in the world. Somebody, I think it was Daniel Garner, who said, if you look at war, look at how much it separates everybody. But if you have an optimistic perspective, you could say it's actually the biggest thing to bring. Yeah, to unite, because it unites each side. So, like I said, it's stupid, but it's like, there's not going to be like
if you ever played football, you get the same feeling from team sports. There's something deep in our being that likes to have something to get together and fight about.
Well,
but
yeah,
we ritualize it to try to protect the damage.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would say that's a healthy outlet for it. There's healthy outlets for it. There's unhealthy outlets for it.
Well, what I'm saying is we're not going to. I don't see a scenario where we lose human competition or games or enjoying things or being just alive and in the fucking mesh of things. And there's this bizarre way in which, like Robert's saying, the way in which they want to control the outcome becomes this bizarre confession of their overall lack of faith that things can work out when you collaborate. And like I said, as if we don't control the playing field enough, we lose faith that we lose the faith that we'll ever even have a playing field. And that's a lot of, it's such a bizarre thing to see, where it's like, why do you think if we don't do it this way, then tomorrow we'll somehow lose the actual ability to play games with each other, or the ability to have competition, or the ability to have, contrast and synergy with each other, if we don't control every aspect and then possibly, bomb the other country, because maybe it's such a weird, bizarre, backwards way of looking at it.
Yeah, can I flip that into a quick question for Benjamin, and then anybody else who wants to ask it, because it's been on the back of my mind for an hour. It's about rites of passage, right? And so you talk about games, and then some people immediately think about play, and that's sort of like the developmental psychological perspective is like playing games. People who get a PhD in psych usually learn about the Piaget approach to game, right? But basically, play is the important difference as opposed to work. So basically, that's another polarity. When you switch that polarity from work to play, it gets super deadly serious. When you play games that have stakes as an adult. And so, what I wanted to talk about, I'll flip it to Benjamin and then anybody else, about the idea of rites of passage. Like when you were talking about consciousness, it's like most of the biggest conflicts we have in our life are centered around rites of passage and about understanding ourselves in conflict with reality, with the institutions, with the roles we're going to be assuming or playing, becoming an adult, becoming old, going through middle life, these marriage, death, all these rituals. So my thinking is like, so would you say, like, again, flipping it back to consciousness on the continuum, isn't there like a punctuated equilibrium, like where you move slowly and then you move fast through a rite of passage? And when you move slowly, there's more possibility of cooperation because there's a stability. When you go through rites of passage, it's sort of like a ritualized conflict with yourself, with life, with reality, and then you have to be remade and reborn a little bit. How does that hit you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It feels a little abstract, like I can tie it into my own rites of passages, but I mean, my own experience with that is I've almost died a few times, through having cancer, getting hit by a car, navigating ME/CFS, which is one of the most ego-shattering illnesses anybody can have. I mean, I've collapsed many times. I've been bedridden for months on end, unable to even look at a screen or a cell phone or a TV. I was so sick I could barely walk, for months and months and months. And so
I met you like right after that. It was like right after the worst was when we started becoming Facebook friends. You probably don't remember because you had a lot going on. So
yeah, that was probably the third time that I've been the worst, because I've been severe 3 times now. That's a whole nother long conversation about ME/CFS and how it shows up for people. There's different levels of severity, and I've been severe 3 times. Severe basically means you can barely walk, you can barely talk. You have to be taken care of. It's a pretty crazy illness. But yeah,
so do you see illness is like a forced, sort of like intense, extra rite of passage? Like when you go through like these,
hugely, because in each one of those times I wanted to die. I considered ending my life. It felt like I was dying. I felt like there's no way I could come back from this. I for sure thought I was going to die. And if I didn't, I was going to go choose medical assisted suicide or something, for sure. And each one of those times I had to dig super, super, super deep into my own willpower to live. I had to find like the deepest core of my life force within, even though it felt like there was nothing. And I had to feel it and sit with it and just meditate with it for hours. I had to feel into my heart and my love for life, my love for myself, in order to drive me and to do what I needed to do to get better, which was actually hours and hours and hours every day of meditation, nervous system regulation, qigong, deep rest, yoga, yin yoga, connecting with nature, slowing way down, all day, every day for months.
And that's very different when you're doing that therapeutically than rather for sort of journeying, as some people do for almost leisure.
Yeah, right. The way to compare that would be what a lot of people do in the spiritual community is they'll go, we can compare this to like indigenous rites of passage, where they go out to to nature for a couple of days, no food, no water, just journeying in that state, or working with plant medicines and having these massive ego death experiences and dying experiences, all of the different DMT component plant medicines. And I would say it's similar, except those are like they're like the light version of it, because this
Right.
version is like there's no. I'm
See, to me,
thrust
it's
into
more
this.
play and not as much work, right?
Yeah, that is more play. Yeah, mine is my version. My experience with it is more like there is no out. It's like when I'm in like a 3 or 4 month crash. It's like that'd be a long time to be on like a fasting journey or tripping or doing a plant medicine journey or some shamanic thing. 3 or
Reminds
4
me of
months.
parenthood, and there's no out if
Yeah.
you're going to be a good parent, and you've got to go
Yeah.
through the hardest experiences that your child is going to go through, which could be both journeying and crisis and trauma, and that's really tough to observe from a third person.
I'm curious if at the very end here we wanted to touch on Angela's last question, or maybe we could like ping pong around with that. I don't know if we have enough time.
I was hoping Thomas could sort of take it home, and
Yeah.
maybe he could play with that a little bit.
Yeah.
Sure. I was just gonna mention a few things that I thought of during the conversation. So when she was Angela talking about chimpanzees, I also thought of, well, yeah, that's true that human beings are very closely related to chimpanzees and they're aggressive, but we're also 98% related to bonobos,
I was going to say that too. Yeah.
who are a lot more peaceful and not as aggressive.
Well,
So,
they're sexually violent instead of physically violent. That's the
Yeah, but
discovery about
sex
them.
is a handshake for bonobos, right? For a
They-
lot of
they-
female bonobos.
When they're doing nice things, they're sexual, and we're doing
Right.
terrible things, they're sexual. They just
Yeah.
put it all through that lens. That's part of what I meant about the
And-
whole, like the sort of the
Makes sense.
matriarchal version of Machiavellian games is that it can become a sort of well, we're not going to beat each other to death, but we're just going to manipulate each other to death. And that's some of what we see in nature. It's just a different format. It's very
well, yeah, and that goes to the issue of having more women in power. That might work in cases where uh, the ideology or the underlying value system of that society um, is sufficient. It holds up sufficient value so that society is good. And yes, female behavior will cluster a certain direction to be less like overtly violent, but doesn't mean they're not covertly violent, like you're saying. And there's intrasexual competition that goes on.
so it's just
We
the
can
lesbian relationship violence being like
no,
insanely
no,
high.
but to Angela's point, there is at least anecdotal examples of like Iceland and certain banks holding on to wealth when the systems crashed because the women that were in charge in this case were less impulsive and they were able to make
Mhm.
more calm decisions and not be so um, like they're more risk averse, so they're more cautious. Whereas the guy, we gotta do something, we gotta do something now. So there is something to that. How well that scales and how it interacts with other things, I don't know. I think women at the same time are in the aggregate more susceptible to like certain types of ideological influence or at least perpetuating it because it at least if it's something that activates empathy and then it can get into suicidal empathy games, so you want to avoid that, and having men in
Yeah.
power can prevent that. But also, yes, men with their history of war and conquering and the, the but it can't be as simple as just playing a gender game. I think Benjamin was right to say game theoretic dynamics can still occur. It doesn't matter which gender's in charge. You kind of have to build a system that is not based on that. Um, and just to
Right. It's the
use
structure,
yeah
not the content. So it's the idea
yeah
that
yeah.
either gender could thrive, either gender could fall into Machiavellian behavior, and
So
but but there are unique things that I will say, as my final point, Thomas, I agree with you. There are unique contributions that women made that restored balance so when you have highly equal societies, that basically the women are really good at holding that as a high virtue, perpetually, constantly. Whereas men tend to oscillate based on the temperature of society. We are very easily hot-headed about violence when it shows up, and so it's harder for men to maintain any sort of balance without a little bit of female dominance in that communication pattern.
Can I just say too that I'm not suggesting that we move from patriarchy to matriarchy. It just seems to me that, females are half the population, but we're not half of the leadership. We're not half of the power. And maybe there's something of value to the perspective that feminine energy brings when we're thinking about systems and self-organizing. And we've gotten really out of balance, and it broke our world.
Totally.
Of course. I think the balance definitely
unity agreement, we needed that desperately. And this is the reason. Oh, I forgot to mention, among all the other things I did, I taught women's studies, which is unusual for a hetero white guy. But well, of course, I also don't like calling myself white. I'm very proud of being Irish. So it's and when you're Irish, the whole idea of you being part of some sort of deep colonial privilege is amusing, because you never got to really, you were a slave during that time. And so, but so and again, anyway, it's those things are complex. So I like to say that basically, you have to get into these additional layers. And so, for example, even in the feminine, it's like, what energy are we talking about, Gaia or Lilith? So there's different feminine attractors and just different phases of feminism. And the women's studies professor I worked with, Patricia Sloan White, she's still at University of Delaware, and she was sort of what you call in the post-feminist wave, where she was one of the earliest female bosses on Wall Street. Basically, she kind of made it to the top, and then saw the kind of shit you saw in Wolf of Wall Street movie. She saw that shit firsthand, and she kept trying to play it straight. And then she said, I give up. This is just out of control, because it was at that peak period. And so she left. She said, got her PhD from Oxford University in anthropology, traveled the world and studied women in business. And that's where she was the one who kind of coaxed me to get into business, because she was like, you can take your anthropological learnings and even your social learnings and sort of convert that into something pliable. But so she's a really good example of somebody who taught me all the different competing female attractors, that men have competing attractors. Gender is really not a unity. That all genders are heavily fragmented between the sort of the archetypal within roles. Are you from the warrior class? Are you Brahmin class? And that's a Brahmin woman is a very different thing than Xena the warrior princess. It's not the same role.
Can I just add one quick thing too, is that one of the reasons I like polymathy as a lens for understanding the human condition and also how we get to a better world is because when someone's a part of many different in-groups, I'm female and I'm European and I'm a Washington, D.C., living in that area. And I'm lots of different things, which means I don't over-identify with any of them. Because I just partly identify with a lot of different groups. And I think that's one of the things that we will see in a world that gets less in-group, out-group aggressive, is that when we all embrace all the things that we really are and stop fitting into simplistic boxes, because society suggests that's a good thing to do, like the age of specialization told us to do. When we can embrace all that we are, I think it makes us more empathetic. We find more common ground. We understand the benefit of diversity in all its many forms. And I think that's one of the things that will help make our world better, is when people embrace their inner polymathic capacities.
Thomas, you want to wrap it up? You can finish what you were saying.
Yeah, sure. Well, I didn't have much more to say on that, but I was wondering if you guys want to wrap up, or well, we can save it for a next discussion. But there's something I want to touch on potentially before we leave, and because it kind of ties to what we're talking about a little bit, and it was brought up throughout the conversation in various ways. Is AI, and it was mostly talked about in a positive way. And I'm not a techno optimist or techno pessimist. I'm a techno realist. I think there's good and bad, and it depends how it's used. And I'm just wondering what you guys think, especially because it seems relevant timing with the AI documentary coming out, and Black mentioned Tristan Harris, and I was just wondering what you guys think about the alignment problem with AI and how we can. Obviously, that can be another hour or two, and we don't need to do that. But if you guys
Yeah.
want to set up
So,
something,
I'm going to let Black have the last word before we end, but we want to set this up as a seg into the next conversation, because what I want to
yes,
do is like have that as being the next one. But go ahead and like
yes,
give us the cliffhanger.
Yeah, so it's interesting because when Angela was talking, I'm like, man, how do I interject? How do I say my position? And one of the things I said before was that I'm a divine feminine apologist and an AI apocalypse alarmist, because I think that those things are so, intrinsically connected, and it's very hard to even see the truth of that thing. And one of the people who I think describes it the best, and who I've had the best conversations about this really esoteric, this really spiritual side of it, is Layman Pascal. When we're talking deep about so even just real quick to get into what Angela said, okay, so she's a woman, she's had a baby. This is an experience that men can't have. There's a bunch of different reasons why that informs who we are as men, and sometimes can inform what we look at as the negative sides of the patriarchy. It's actually very simple. Women who have a line of grandmothers and mothers, there's situations where they might not want to send the child to war after they've been in 9 months labor, and they have that connection to the child. That plays into and informs what I said about men losing faith. Certain tribes had tradition, like Native American tribes had developed the traditions of sweating in the same way you see sweat lodges and stuff. It was originally supposedly historically created because they didn't menstruate, because the women had this specific connection to this initiatory process that they went through, and the men, to kind of mimic that, would do this thing where they would intentionally make themselves sweat and do all these different things. And so that also goes back to what we were talking about initiation and stuff like that. So in that, I would say
body fluids related to purity and toxicity. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah. The worst aspect, and this is, like I said, it's such a Black Mirror like horror show that I think we don't register it. The worst aspect comes when the AI alignment or misalignment, and the sort of inclination to anthropomorphize and to make this AI human, starts to tell us that we should have these designer babies and cybernetic children and stuff like that, again with no context of what we are all talking about here. We are all talking about a different world, a more sane world, connecting and all this stuff. When the top of that layer of the cybernetic horror comes through the absolute defilement of the divine feminine, or of the feminine in general, and disconnects her from her body and her children and her her generational coherency, that's the worst side of it that I see. So that's where I stand on the misalignment of AI.
Yeah, and I like how you brought in the eugenic factor, and how you could tear an entirely new rift in feminism just over that one word. In the long run, it's unbelievably important. Again, talking about the multipolar problems you can fall into in trying to perfect the female experience, or the motherhood experience, or the experience. That's another one. That's a whole video. All right, guys. I hope you guys had fun. This was a good initial group for us. I think everybody was kind of enjoying it. Go ahead, Thomas.
No, go ahead. You can wrap it up if you like.
Anyone else have the last word?
I feel like a takeaway for me is that we need to reconsider how we organize to solve the problems of our time, and continuing to learn is how we're going to get there. And one other final thing I'll say is, looking out at 8 billion people on the planet Earth, there are many people in survival mode, and they're not in a position to organize. They're just trying to make it to the next day. And so if we need intelligence and ethics to solve the problems of our time, I think it's up to those of us in a position to help to do the hard work of organizing and figuring it out. And we're going to have to co-learn and co-sense make, much like we were doing here tonight. So I hope that you continue these efforts and continue to integrate minds together so we can learn from one another.
My goal is to motivate everybody to keep finishing their projects and shamelessly borrow from recent stimulation from other people, because it's one of the best sources to get you outside of your rut is to remember to steal a little bit.
Yeah.
Solar pirate.
That's how we expand our mental models. We keep taking in information. We can't get stuck in what we know. We got to keep learning.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
All right. So I hope you guys will join us for another one of these. We're going to be starting to do these in a regular cycle. And there's going to be other folks that I think will seamlessly fit into the same flow. It's cool that we had a few at the beginning so that basically everybody's already had the initial patterning, and we can sort of help to seed more conversations as we rotate.
Thank you guys.
Thanks so much for having me.